Hi, I'm Anna. I work on Node.js core. It's pretty much most of what I do. I'm ADDALEAX if you want to look me up on Twitter. I've been working on Node core for 4.5 years, I think it is now. And I've been with Neoform, so the same company as Adam and a couple other people around here. The same company as David. For a while now too, and I work at Neoform Research, which is kind of the R&D division of Neoform. Which, for me, it basically means mostly getting to work on cool new Node.js features. So if you know me for anything, like know my name, have heard about it, it's probably because I did a lot of work behind worker threads in Node. But yeah. But yeah, anyway, so Node is 11 years old now, which is like a really long time. And I thought it might be nice to like have a little retrospective on the things that went well and the things that didn't go so well. And I mean, there's always like the elephant in the room, which is Deno, which is the new cool thing. And I kind of wanted to share my thoughts on that from like the perspective of somebody who's been working on Node for a while. So yeah, it's the 11th birthday, the 11th anniversary of the 001 tag. Like the project itself is actually a bit older than that in terms of Git history. I actually did take a look at the commit that was included in the v001 tag, and none of the files in there exist anymore. It's like it adds support for some things on FreeBSD, so it's mostly touching build files for Node or V8, and yeah, all of that has been long gone from the source tree. And yeah, so this is the GitHub graph of contributions for Node.js as it looks right now. And the first thing you might notice when you look at that is that there was a time when a lot more commits per time were pushed. There was a drop, and then it kind of like turned into somewhat stable growth again. And I don't know how long you all have been working with Node. You might remember some of the history here. It's like you probably don't remember the 001 tag. I certainly don't. And I think the first time that I started working with Node myself, that was like around 0.5 or 0.6, something like that. So yeah, that was also like quite a while ago. A lot of you probably remember the 0.10 and 0.12 ages, when Node was under corporate stewardship by Giant, and well, for lots of reasons, people were unhappy with the development and governance model of Node.js at the time. So you might know the IO.js fork and that it happened. Usually when I talk to people, they're not really quite sure what actually happened with IO.js in the long run, because they always kind of stuck to Node.js because that was like the big brand. And that's also kind of what I personally did in the past. Like I didn't really pay attention to the fork because, well, I just kept using Node.js. But yeah, the eventual outcome of that was that the two projects got merged back together. The big release in which the first merged version under the name Node.js was released was v4. And that kind of is the start of like what I would consider modern Node.js history. And I think that's really reflected in the contributor graph there, but also in the terms of like JavaScript features that have been added to Node.js since then and things like that. And this is something that probably even less people remember than the IO.js fork. And there was another one which was called IOJS, which kind of, well, it's a pun on IOJS, obviously. And that didn't do a lot of, in terms of technical work. Well, we got worker threads out of it mostly, but yeah, it was also something that was based on unhappiness with the Node.js collaboration and contribution process and how the governance worked. And that, for me, it seems like it happened quite recently, but it's actually 3 years ago. And well, and so now we're actually at V14 because Node has its schedule that doesn't really follow any restrictions on. Well, we're not saying like, oh, we have so many December major changes piled up, let's do a new December major release, but instead we do the half-year schedule that you might be familiar with. If not, there's like a really nice graphic on the Node.js/release repo on GitHub if you want to look at that, if you aren't familiar with the Node.js release schedule. And yeah, those are all things that were introduced with the merger of IOJS and Node. So so basically all of our current processes also stem from that merger time. So that's also like a big thing of why I think of that as the beginning of Node's modern age, basically. And one thing I particularly want to pay attention to, so like, why are there so many contributions in the first half of that graph? And big part of the reason is like, well, Node.js just was not quite as mature at the time. And in particular, people were just pushing to master if they wanted to change something and not really doing the big, well, the big kind of process that we have right now, which is not that, it's not that much process, but it's still, you open a pull request and the result of that pull request is merged as usually a single commit or a couple commits that are somewhat well structured and that have been reviewed by a number of people. And so that kind of reduces the need for pushing fix up commits again and again and again. So it was kind of a Wild West time for Node.js. And the other thing is, so this was all pre-ES6 and partially even pre-ES5. What that means is, so like a lot of the code that was written at that time is, you would usually consider it legacy code in JavaScript. Or maybe if you want to call it vanilla JavaScript, you could do that. But I think that the meaning of that term has also shifted quite a bit since then. And in particular, what that meant is that like modern features like classes and symbols in particular were missing from Node, which also kind of meant that, well, what did you do before we had symbols in the language? You just like added underscore properties or something. And the combination of of that development model where people were just mostly just pushing to master whatever they thought was the best thing, and the lack of like strong encapsulation, well, that kind of resulted in a Node code base that had lots of internal wires sticking out. So, for example, libraries like Express or HTTP frameworks, for example, they would usually be very liberal about looking into Node's internals. And what that kind of also means is that we're kind of stuck with a lot of legacy code from the time, and that we can't really do anything about right now. And in particular, so some parts of the Node code base that I think that everybody's not that happy with at this point is, well, from that first half of the contributor graph, we got streams, mostly all three versions of streams. We also got HTTP1, the original code, and in particular the TLS code. Like those were all written by people who wanted to get something to work and that was completely reasonable considering the usage of Node at the time, I would say. But the thing is, like, because we have these legacy constraints around Node, the fact that there's millions of Node.js developers out there, and they kind of rely on the behavior that Node exposes, we're kind of bound to be very careful about making changes to these modules. And it's kind of a big problem because, if you think about the code in your projects, if you have any that was written like more than 6 or 7 years ago, you generally, that is not the part of the code base that you want to work with. And that's also kind of like a self-reinforcing problem, because the bus factor for these is very low for these particular modules, because the original authors, they're not really that active anymore. And we have some people who are kind of well-versed in how streams work, some for HTTP1. For TLS, it's a bit trickier even, because I don't think there's anybody at this point who has a really good overview over the internal timing of how things work. We usually, like, so for example, when there's a security issue with TLS or so, it's not usually an issue to find somebody who is able to fix that. But yeah, it's code that could use a large-scale refactor, but that would also break a lot of people probably, and so we're kind of stuck with the current version of it. One very positive thing that I want to call out, though, is, so for example, for streams, there's this guy from Hungary, Robert, and he kind of just did a deep dive into the streams module and is still currently doing that. And he's putting a ton of work into making it have consistent behavior that actually makes sense, and reducing the ways in which the legacy, in which userland code, so all the NPM libraries out there, in which they have to hook into streams internals, he's getting rid of that. He's just doing amazing work, and he's kind of like, I would say he's in charge of streams right now. And it kind of shows that, like, if you are somebody who really sticks to the goal of like taking a piece of code and making it work in a way that's clean and that is backwards compatible, that is possible. But yeah, it's hard to get these people into Node Core. And I mean, like, even for those that are already around Node Core, it's hard to like really focus on one thing and make it work well, especially if it's this kind of legacy code. Another thing that I want to talk about is, so I mean, this is something that people are having tons of discussions about again and again and again. And so this is like kind of opinionated, but Node.js has kind of been showing scope creep, in the sense that, more and more features are being added that don't really have to be inside Node Core, or at least not in some way. I'll get to that in more detail. But I'm starting to feel like putting HTTP1 into Node Core, into the binary that is published, that might have been a mistake, because that kind of invited adding other modules that are either needed for HTTP1 to be usable properly without any external libraries, and it also kind of enabled people to say, oh, we have HTTP1 in code, so we could also do this other thing, which similarly doesn't really need to be in the binary itself, but we might as well add it, because why not? And so there's always been this concept of small core, which means basically anything that can be implemented in userland should be implemented in userland. And that those people, I feel like they are kind of losing the fight over time. And well, I don't want to be too opinionated here. I'm a bit sad about it, because I do believe that small core is a good philosophy generally. Like, have things in user land if they can be implemented in user land. And there's more reasons for that than just like the general scope creep. But we're having these kinds of discussions over and over again. So for example, would you want fetch in Node Core? It's been something we have been debating endlessly. And there's good reasons for doing so and good reasons for not doing so, for sure. But I'm not really that happy with how the impression is among people in that debate around what adding something to Node Core actually means. Because if we go back to, for example, like these modules, streams, HTTP1, TLS, just because something isn't core, it doesn't mean it's well maintained. It doesn't really guarantee anything besides that if there's a security issue, we'll do the best we can to fix it. Kind of because we have to, because we don't want to ship insecure Node.js versions. And in particular, I kind of feel like, the whole bring fetch into core thing, it kind of discards alternative models of how we do Node Core development, which I'm kind of unhappy about. So for example, we just shipping something into the Node binary, that doesn't have to be the only option. It could also be something that we ship as a separate module that still comes with the Node.js core installation by default. Or it could just be a dependency. Like, we could just take node fetch from npm as is and maybe do bake that into the binary, but not do anything besides pull in new releases from npm and update them when we want to. It's kind of what we're doing with things like npm, which is another like another hornet's nest that I kind of don't want to poke. Shipping npm with Node or not, or doing it with Yarn. So there's discussions about that too, if you want to have them. But anyway, so like if we look at what is actually inside the Node Core binary, and this is like the REPL.built-in modules, which I'm not sure is actually released yet, but it is on Node Master. These are the modules that you can load from the REPL command line without having to require them, because we consider them like important built-in modules. And there's lots of them that don't really need to be in Node Core for just code reasons. We don't need to expose assert. We really don't need cluster. But even things like console, HTTP, DNS, REPL, these are all things that there's no real reason not to implement them as user-land modules, because, there's no reason to do that. And obviously we can't get rid of them at this point, because everybody uses them. But it still would be kind of nice to like have the option of not having every single one of these modules maintained in the same repo. And in particular, one thing that I'm happy about is this means that, these are, if you count them, these are about 40 modules. And these are all maintained in the same repository. And that is just kind of a barrier to contributions and to entry to work on Node. Because, obviously, you kind of can't watch the repository if you're not okay with like getting literal hundreds of GitHub notifications each day, even on weekend days. So working on Node Core currently is kind of an all-in or all-out thing where either you have the time to do that and it takes a lot of time, or you don't. We've been trying some ways to get around that problem, but I think the best one would still be like to separate development out, like for modules like, I don't know, DNS, just put that in a separate repo, maybe also publish that repo to NPM, and otherwise just pull it in as a dependency into Node. And the other thing that this kind of forces is that, it kind of pushes people towards not implementing structured internal APIs, because we're kind of in a position where, every part of Node Core can reach into every other part of Node Core. And I wouldn't say we're in a bad place there, but it's also kind of tricky to avoid like spaghetti code problems where, well, yeah, where some part of Node Core reaches into something it probably shouldn't reach into, or something that we could just like do a bit more modularly. And on the other hand, we have things like, so there's this push, and I kind of like it actually, to bring more web APIs into Node Core, kind of push Node more into the direction of a headless browser. And so there's, well, I've listed a couple things. I guess fetch would also be something that would be on that list if we added. And it's kind of like, so should web APIs come with the binary? Because they kind of do for browsers, right? So like these are tricky questions. Like, would we want the same development model for that to happen or not? Yeah. Another thing that I'm personally unhappy about, and I know lots of people disagree, but like if you taken a guess at the number of different deprecated APIs, or in Node's case, well, different deprecation codes that we have issued, and the actual number is like 140 something. And well, I'm not happy about that, because Node.js, the purpose of Node.js is for people to write code for it, and that kind of means that it has to be stable. And even if that means accepting some things that are cool, like keeping legacy code around when we don't have to, we should just do that, because upgrading Node is already a huge pain point for lots of people. And like, just keep it stable. Don't deprecate things if you don't have to. Don't add deprecations warnings if you don't have to, and don't remove features if you don't have to. Because it's, when you're working on Node Core, it's easy to think, well, deprecating something is a one-time thing that you do once, and that's kind of true, because when you're working on Node Core, it's just like you do the deprecation and that's it. And it's easy to forget sight of the fact there's like hundreds of thousands or millions of Node devs that might all have to update their legacy code if they're affected in some way. That's a lot of work. We always should keep that in mind. Maybe I'm a bit too pessimistic here. Maybe these things like scope creep, deprecations, and legacy, and the existence of legacy code and keeping Node stable, they're all pulling nodes into different kinds of directions. And we're definitely striking some kind of balance there, and maybe it's a good one. And if you're unhappy with the kind of balance we're striking, then you should always feel free to get engaged in Node.js Core discussions, especially if they are affecting you. But again, it's hard to do that, and I get that, because, well, Node.js Core core discussions are not made for tons of accessibility for outsiders currently, which is another whole thing that I don't want to get into. So less than 24 hours before now, lots of people were talking about ESM in Node and why it's not a great thing. This particular tweet is something that I kind of want to quote here. Node.js is going to have its lunch eaten by Deno because it never got its shit properly together with ESM. I don't agree with that. Also, Kat said a lot of other things in the talk that I don't necessarily agree with, but I get the frustration, and I guess a lot of other people get the frustration too. It's not something that has a great history in Node ES module support, because what everybody wants is to just do the thing that also works when they use transpilation. So like, you can require something, whatever it is, even if it is an ES module, and you can import something in using ASM, even if it is a common JS module. And that's kind of what everybody would ideally want, right? And in particular, this is kind of what transpiling code gives you. So it's something that lots of Node people already do. Fortunately, it's not going to happen, because the history of ESM, as I understand it, is kind of like, so the JS language spec committee kind of wants to add modules, because browsers don't have modules, and people who write code for browsers, which is still lots and lots of JS devs, more so than for the server side, certainly, they kind of want modules, right? And so they come up with something that works well for browsers. And Node.js is not really being taken into account for that. And that and if you're designing a module system for browsers, you kind of stuck with something like, well, it would sure be nice if, for example, modules were loaded asynchronously, because well, browsers have network latency, and that's kind of something that you want to avoid, or to, like, have it easy to be worked with, that network latency. Node.js doesn't really have that same concern, because require is synchronous and it loads from the disk, and usually that's just fast enough for everybody. And so, well, the thing that the JS language came up with that turned us something where we were probably too slow to recognize that these things are not fundamentally gonna be, they're gonna have fundamental incompatibilities, in particular around things like async resolution or async module loading versus sync module loading. Where we kind of end up with is two incompatible systems, which is really bad. And for example, I would not agree with the people that say that this is purely Node's fault. It's kind of also, or mostly, the JS language's fault. But again, well, we're kind of stuck with taking the path that's most backwards compatible, right? Anyway, so I've been very negative, and I know that I'm kind of going over time here, so I want to skip ahead a bit. So something that I'm excited about. This ratio is really good for an open source project. If you go to other ones like Linux or V8 or something, they're not near this. And obviously, this doesn't mean that like every Node.js core contributor has 10 commits in there. There's obviously still some inequality in the distributions of these, but it's still like, it means that the community is a lot more involved in contributing to Node.js core than it is in other projects, and I do consider that a really good thing. We currently have exactly 100 collaborators with write access to Node core. Obviously, not every one of these is super active these days, but it's still like it's a broad contributor base, something that is good and healthy for Node core, and I'm really happy about that. Another thing that I'm really happy about is how we're starting to work a lot better with other languages that are not JavaScript. In particular, so like the div that I'm taking here, that is from one of the modules that I maintain when I converted it from a regular Node.js add-on that it was written in C++ to an API. And an API is this great new way, or not so new at this point, of writing add-ons that feel a lot simpler to write, and where you don't need to know nearly as much about V8 internals. So if you look at the code on the left that has been deleted, you'll actually, if you know the V8 API, you will notice that this is not good code. and so the thing about converting to an API makes things so much easier for C++ developers who don't have a lot of Node core internals experience to write native add-ons for Node. It makes it so much harder to get things wrong. I really do love that. And one other thing is, like, you can write add-ons for other languages with it now. I know that people have written Node.js add-ons in Rust, because you can now. That's really nice. WASM, and in particular WASI, is also really nice. If you don't know what WASI is, maybe look it up at some point. It's basically a way for WASM code in Node.js or other runtime environments to get access to a system calls or system call like things. So like they can actually do very standard things that other programs can do too, so like access the file system, print things to standard out, things like that. And I'm not going to go into detail of the code here because, again, I know I'm running over time. But yeah, it's a great thing if you want to write, for example, your Node.js application partially in Rust. You can just do that. You can take a Rust file, you can compile it to WASM. You can still use lots and lots of system libraries, and you will end up with something that you can run from Node, which is, I love it. Another thing that I also think went really well, but I guess that's more for Tamar to talk about later. I have gotten really great feedback about worker threads in Node Core. Definitely not the kind of feedback we're getting for ESM, and I'm happy about how that went. Even if I did a lot of work for that myself. And so yeah, some final words on like the dinosaur in the room. Deno recently released its 1.0.0 version. And yeah, so people kind of are worried about it splitting the ecosystem or something like that, or splitting the JavaScript world into, well, there's Node users and Deno users. If you didn't know, the official mascot of Node.js is a rocket turtle. So that's why it's on the right hand side here. And they're kind of worried about this, like, some people are going to use this, some people are going to use that. Is Deno going to push Node.js out of existence? And I don't think that's realistic at all, because, well, it's all JavaScript in the end, and people are caring about that fact. And so, for example, I know Deno has some Node.js compatibility APIs. And if Deno gets popular and we have to watch it a bit more carefully, I'm sure Node.js will either have its own compatibility APIs for it, or people are going to come up with something for that on NPM. Because, for example, there's no reason why Deno wouldn't be able to work, like the API wouldn't be able to, it couldn't be implemented on top of the Node.js API or vice versa. So that's something interesting to look at. And the other thing that I mentioned earlier is that, well, web APIs are being pulled into Node, and I'm kind of assuming that the same thing is going to happen with Deno. So the more realistic situation is that Deno, Node.js, and the web are going to all converge into something that is a bit more similar. And well, I at least I hope that's what's going to happen. But I also think that's kind of what people want. They want to write code for JavaScript that kind of just runs. And if people are happier with letting Deno run than Node, then so be it. So, like, ultimately, is Deno going to replace Node.js? Maybe, but like, who really cares? I mean, I work on Node.js, but if it does, there's probably good reasons for that. I'm not worried about it doing that, because Node has been around for an incredibly long time, and people are going to keep using software that has been battle tested for a long time too. Not everybody's going to jump on the hype train right away. And we don't really know how that's going to turn out. But really, in the end, let's just hope that the best platform is the one that's going to be used most. And yeah, that's about it. I'm here if you want to chat. I'm also on Twitter with the handle ADDALEX. I love the Node.js community. I love talking about this, and I will post the slides shortly on Twitter. And again, sorry for going over time, but I'm going to stop talking now. And
let's put my camera back on. Thank you very much,
Thank
Anna.
you for listening.
And I think that's I mean, how do we do? Give a big round of applause in the chat for Anna. There are some questions in the Q&A that would be, I think, interesting to hear. If you've got a couple of minutes to look at them, they're both basically similar questions. I don't know if there's a quick answer to each of those. And it might be worth catching up with you afterwards to discuss this. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute. Anna, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I don't know. We it's probably best if you want to talk about that if we just do it at the tables afterwards, because I don't think there's good answers, and different Node.js people who are here might have different opinions about that anyway. So yeah.
Things I want to ask you about later actually is the relationship with worker threads to Node's sort of very self-consciously stated sort of single-threaded identity at the beginning, and how sort of, it was all against threads at that point, and now we sort of seem to have come full circle, or encapsulated threads into our single-threaded identity as well, which but I don't know, I don't even know what the question is, so it's this.
Yeah. I can answer that if you want. I mean,
yeah, I'd love to hear.
Worker threads have a very narrow scope of usage, which is like if you have CPU intensive applications where you profit from moving that work off the main thread, and particularly if you profit from fast data transmission between the different threads. That is what worker threads are really good at. And I'm not saying like you definitely shouldn't use them for things like I/O. James and I have looked at that. James is somebody who's here and who's also, well, he's my manager. And like if you're using nodes built in APIs, that's always going to be faster than worker threads. There's really no reason to use worker threads for things that you could just use nodes built in APIs for. So yeah, it's very narrow scope of usage for worker
Well, I mean,
threads.
I think that's a terrific segue into our next talk, because we happen to be hearing about worker threads. A great introduction. I don't think any more is needed, but thank you very much, and a big, I'll give you an audible round of applause. Thank you, Anna, for your talk. It's fascinating to get the perspective, and a lot of food for thought there, I think that we can all think about. I mean, I've got notes that I made, so I'll probably have some more questions for you later at the table.
Cool.
Thanks again. Okay, so we are ready for our next talk as soon as Tamar is ready to join us, and we're just going to move straight on. Meanwhile,